Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel for you today. First, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions for our panelists, we do want you to go ahead and send those in using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. That's also where you're going to find the chat tab, and this is where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members, contribute to today's conversation, or maybe just let us know from where you're tuning in. And finally, before we close, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. Our topic today is identity and access management. And I'm joined by Wade Ellery, VP of Solutions Architects and Senior Technical Evangelist at Radiant Logic. We have Josh Hoagie, Senior Sales Engineer at Strong DM. And leading our conversation today, we're joined by Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer here at Techstrong Group. Mike, Josh, Wade, thank you all so much for being here. Mike, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thanks, Cody. Well, let's just dive right in. Hey, Wade, how you doing?
Doing great. Having a great time here in California.
All right. Well, you've got enough gray hair there that I can lead this question with you, and we'll start with this and we'll go from here. But I remember a day when, identity access and management and all this stuff was, generally an extension of Active Directory. And, it was a small group of people who were concerned and, they were passionate about it, but the rest of the organization kind of ignored it. And now we live in this age where everybody's accessing stuff in the cloud. We have more remote users maybe than we have folks on premise. So has the whole nature of the conversation changed? Are you surprised over the years to have seen this change? And do you think that, identity access management is kind of hip?
Well, I've always thought identity and access management was hip. Couldn't convince my kids of it, but for me, it was always an exciting area. To some degree, I think you're right. We were kind of shouting in the woods and only talking among ourselves about the importance. But the idea of risk being evaluated now and how that plays a part in the whole IT infrastructure then leads right back to the conversation of identity and access management. Because really the only way you can now manage risk, and risk being the ability to make sure that bad operators don't get access to the wrong information, bad operators don't make changes in your environment that are detrimental, that you're able to protect yourself from really an active force out there that is trying to compromise your system. All that goes back to the idea of identity and access management. So it is a very technical area. It's not necessarily sexy, but we started out with things like single sign-on, making it easier for the end user. As we've gone now to digital transformation with customers, the commercial side of the business is realizing that making access smooth and easy and frictionless and complete is critical to competing. And I think the C-suite now is recognizing this component plays a major part in the business operations themselves. So that's kind of brought us into the room.
All right. Josh, do you think that the principles are different or now than they were years ago, or is it just a different level of scale at this point, and we're just trying to figure out how to manage it in a way that is cohesive enough to operate across thousands of people? Or, have we changed fundamentally our thinking and approach to identity and access management?
I think it's largely the same as it was 20 years ago. I mean, or 30 years ago even. By and large, providing the right access to the right people at the right time, really hasn't changed. But it just used to be that access was, approaching an actual, terminal that was on a network that was really only between that terminal and the mainframe it existed, to as an interface to. And now that's completely been blown out the door by, but not only cloud transformation and, web 1.0 and 2.0. We're getting ready to push trust out. We're already doing this with the web 3.0 stuff, where all of a sudden, all of those computing primitives now have the idea of trust wrapped around it. And I think that that's making us examine it maybe in a different context. I think that's really all that's changed.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of that context, it's not just about us, right? It seems like the bad guys have discovered identity and they're chasing people's credentials more so than ever. And a lot of that drives the ransomware attacks that we're seeing. So at the other end of the spectrum, have the cybersecurity criminals kind of also shine a spotlight on this whole space. And this is part of the whole issue we're seeing as well, Wade.
Definitely. I mean, the bank robber Willie Horton, when asked, why do you rob banks? Because, well, that's where the money is. What criminals have recognized is that first they were stealing your information. They compromise an environment, get a lot of data, sell that on the internet, and people can do identity theft with it. But when ransomware became almost ubiquitous and really available widely, it was recognized that now a compromise can actually be something you can ransom immediately for payment. And so there's an escalation war going on as the bad operators figure out a new vulnerability and take advantage of it. We patch it, we build better networks, we segment our networks, we lock down faster on ransomware attacks. There'll be another generation of attacks coming down the road. So it really is a two sides playing with the same tools. In fact, a lot of the tools that are used in the attack side are tools that started on the protect and build side. So you are looking at the same pieces being manipulated for different purposes.
Josh, did you go ahead?
I was going to say, Wade, you really don't feel like microsegmentation is going to save us all, based on that comment. Like I've heard a lot of, I've heard of a lot like people evangelize that, right? Like, hey, look, we can put you on your own /32 and God help you if you want to try to spread laterally. But
yeah,
you also mentioned there's a lot of identities. I don't think just like the vulnerability chains that are involved in compromise these days, there's often an identity chain as well. So you start and then you try to escalate and then obfuscate all that through identity as well. So that runs parallel to the to the actual vulnerability side of it, or maybe it is part of it and I'm just being naive. I don't know.
No, I think you're right, and I agree. It's this in my mind. Doing this long enough, we'll network segment that'll block lateral movements and ransomware spreading quickly. But then they'll figure out a way to put a ransomware packet as a sidecar on some container platform. It'll roll in under the network packet layer below, because virus scanning was going to take care of everything. I have a good virus scanner, I'm safe. And so there's always going to be another door to open somewhere in the system. And our job basically is to respond as quickly as possible, recognize that another crack in the wall is there and patch it. It'll be a cat and mouse game for quite a long time. I don't see a point where we build a wall high enough and deep enough and round enough to protect us from everything, especially as we start to go further and further out into the world. And as you start to look at things like sovereign identity, now I'm going to take identity and potentially give it to a person. My dad, who, basically wouldn't go to the ATM, he had to go inside the bank, is going to have his own identity. He's going to share on the internet and be secure from his perspective. There's a whole nother generation of stuff to work on out there coming down the road, I think.
Well, Josh, we've been at this thing for 20 years, and now that's established. But for a lot of the newbies, what makes identity and access management hard? I mean, people look at it and they go, well, you want to establish some credentials, you want to give people a password, and you want to make sure that they have the rights to access whatever they're accessing. And a lot of business users especially would be like, okay, that doesn't sound very hard. What's the big deal? So what makes this category so challenging for people to first establish and then maintain?
First of all, there's a lot of them. So that the tech stack, if we want to call it that, is for all intents and purposes limitless, right? I mean, we're gonna try the next new hot thing, when it comes out. So let's say that's a database, or let's say that's a another API that I want to bring in that's going to make my life demonstrably easier, as an admin or as a developer. That in and of itself, just the limitless nature of logins and IDs, and gosh, if I'm interacting with an API, that's another identity, right? And that API itself, as it interfaces with me, is an identity. So how do I, like we see a whole bunch of proliferation, at least in the enterprise segment of things, where we have, GRC teams, involved, where they really want to try to get or vendor risk teams, where organizations are really making an attempt to wrap their minds around all of the different, not only attack surfaces, but all of the different places that we have to think of identity in the first place. So yeah, it's hard because the tech stack itself is polymorphic. Everything has a different shape. I can do totally different things to like a MongoDB instance than I can to Postgres, if we're just speaking databases. So even if you as an admin know me and can say, this is Josh, what Josh can do to one database or one API endpoint is totally different and exposes a completely different set of risks. So I think it's hard from like first principles, really.
So Wayne, do you think it's really coming down to the overall size of the surface we're trying to protect? And do people really appreciate the fact that it's not just people that have identities, but to Josh's point, machines have identities, applications have identities, APIs have identities. So, not everybody's a dog on the internet. They have multiple personalities, right?
Yeah, definitely. The sheer scale of what we're talking about, you talk about the number of IoT devices out there in the world is like multiples of tens or hundreds of the population of the world. So there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure out there that becomes both something you have to potentially interact with and leverage and benefit from, but also something you have to defend yourself from. But the other piece about that makes it a challenge is that we also include human beings in this formula. I still get notices from our internal security department saying the CEO really needs gift cards. Please get some right now and mail them to this address. And they're, testing the end user who will still do what the CEO says. Or I've got, a scenario where I've got a tremendous amount of IT debt built up. I just don't know who has access to what. I have business processes that were never documented. IT didn't work with the app developers to add security. How does Betty get her job done? We don't know. We just gave her access to everything. She seems to be happy. So to secure these environments now, you have to take into consideration all the human factors that go into that play. And moving the business towards more process, more function, more security is always a push and pull with making things easy, making things easy and frictionless for the end user and for the customer. So there's a lot there in terms of scale, but there's also the innate complexity of just managing behavior.
All right. Josh, we have the buzzword of the moment, zero trust. It's everywhere. Everywhere you go, everybody's talking about, we're going to move to zero trust. Kind of makes you wonder what they've been doing all these years. But besides that, how do I get to zero trust? Because it's not like something I go out and buy. It's not like I can roll out of bed and say, yep, I'm going to go get me some zero trust today and I'll be done by lunch. So what's involved in zero trust and where does it intersect with identity and how does all this come together in your mind?
Well, I think the phrase that is top of mind is that identity is the new perimeter. That in this, distributed workforce who's in hybrid mode and is not sitting at a terminal, could potentially be logging in from their own personal computer or their child's computer. I've seen that before where you're like, oh, I didn't realize maybe I've been mispronouncing your first name. It's like, oh no, that's my kid's name. I just I'm using their computer. Those are the kind of things those are the kinds of challenges that we have out there with zero trust. And I think it's also I promise Zscaler is not paying me to say this, but it's zero trust network access. Like people rarely put the latter two terms on there, but that is to me, it goes back to how do you talk on the network? And it used to be that if you were link local, or there was a router in between you that you knew and trusted, you didn't have to worry about that. And that doesn't exist anymore because of that. So hence bringing identity into the picture is one of the ways that we get visibility on who did what and on what endpoint and where and and when. I think that's very, very relevant to the idea of actually implementing it. I think the other thing is that yeah, like you can absolutely bring lots of zero trust principles into your network, but ultimately you're going to have to trust some, some origin or some root of identity, whether that's a PKI certificate. And, I realize that's a huge mess, especially for people that are in the federal side of things. Or whether it's, asserting that somebody's digital ID, maybe it's, derived from some sort of DLT or blockchain. Someday I have yet to see it in a professional context, but someday that's going to be real in ways that are going to fundamentally change how we trust people and how we trust their transactions on a network.
Wait, is it really attainable to have total zero trust IT, or maybe we're just kind of getting better and maybe we'll be at 90%, 95? I mean, ultimately, it seems like there's a lot of holes in the system anyway. So can I get to 100% zero trust?
Well, I think what we've really done is a shift in the marketplace, and this goes back to the vendors, is we've been honest this time with the customer to say, as you mentioned earlier, zero trust is not a product. It's not a solution. It's a journey. That zero trust is an evolution, and you're going to incrementally move closer and closer to the asymptote on your curve. You're never going to achieve it completely. You'll get your percentages higher and higher. The market will shift, the attack surfaces will shift, and you'll adjust again. But I think starting with the basic concept that instead of giving you all the access I think you're going to need, and then auditing that once a quarter, once a year, and not actually being able to clearly determine whether or not that audit is even accurate or what you need is what you're getting, I'm going to start with, I need to authenticate you first. I need to know for certain you are who you say you are when you arrive. And once I've done that with a level of certainty, I'm going to give you the minimum amount of access you need to do what you're asking for. And as you ask for more access, I'm going to evaluate your information, your profile, everything I know about you, what we've been able to accumulate, and make a decision on whether or not you should get the additional access and incrementally provide that access going forward. That gives us a model to actually throttle down the risk and look at that particular scenario. Now, one I describe is, okay, I've got someone coming in from South Korea at 2:00 in the morning on a Friday night trying to access financial information in the financial platform. Well, that's a hard no, except that the IP address is coming in off of an office we have in South Korea. The ID actually authenticated as the CFO. His travel records show in his profile we updated when he left the country that he is in South Korea. And it's the end of the quarter and he has to sign off on the financials so Wall Street gets their numbers on Monday. That's a hard yes.
Yeah, well, but you don't want to be the help desk, person on call for that said no initially, and then gets completely lit up, because you're blocked. So
exactly. So that hard no is not an option. If the system is intelligent enough to have enough information, then it can make a valid decision about that particular user. The context now becomes extremely important. That's an extreme case, but the context,
that's a lot of data sources, right? So we talk defense in depth very, very frequently in the security domain, right? It's like, well, you can't just trust that your network's good and the endpoint's good. It's some combination of all of that, right? And maybe there's, some endpoint software that's out there that's, adding an extra layer that wouldn't be there natively. We're really good at generating lots and lots of data off of our endpoints and off of our, network devices. I think we're not nearly as good at telling good stories based on that data. And we're also not very good at necessarily surfacing all that data in a way that we can take action on. And that's the hard part. I totally agree with you, Wade. But and the example that was coming to mind is look in the financial services industry. I have heard staggeringly low second factor challenges, like less than 5% sometimes are challenged on second factor at specific bands worth of transaction amounts, because the bank can just say, hey, look, if a certain percentage of these are going to go sideways on us, we can absorb that, because the impediment to getting that work done for a customer or for an insider is sometimes not worth the downside cost. And that's I think this is where, at least to my mind, this is where like all of your compliance stuff comes in really, really big, and figures into is like, what do you absolutely have to comply with? And what is your auditor going to say if you don't have a handle on, the following identity related metrics?
All right. Well, I want to encourage everybody to start asking questions, but while I shift to the next one, you bring this up in compliance, and I'm always wondered, Wade, maybe you have some thoughts on this first, but who's in charge of identity access management in these organizations? I mean, we've all worked for companies, kind of goes something like this, new employee comes along and, eventually we get them a laptop, and then eventually we provision what they have access to. And, there's usually anywhere from a week to 3 weeks before they're fully productive, just because we don't really understand what it is they're supposed to be accessing in the first place. But then over the course of their career, we give them more access to different things. And IT sits there and says, every time they get an authorization from HR or a business exec, they're like, sure. And then after 10 years, this person quits and nobody knows what they have access to, because nobody deprovisioned what they were supposed to be access to, as they went along. And so they have access to essentially everything. So who's in charge of this mess? I mean, is it the IT side, or is it the business side? Or, we have this whole notion of over provisioning, but it seems like it's just rampant. So, how did we get there, and what do we do about it?
Well, and that goes back to the whole concept of zero trust. Zero trust says, let's flip the game. Let's give you the least amount of privilege and then authorize your access in the moment based on what we know about you and whether that access is reasonable and whether you're asking for it in a secure manner at a secure time, or I need to know more about you to authorize that. What you're pointing out is the very conundrum that we're in right now, which is I've created so much access in accounts. And I will argue that the days of reviewing and testing to access with groups, that fallacy is being stripped away. People have realized for a while now that when a manager looks at 55 groups you're a member of and says yes to all, he's doing that because he has no idea what those groups do, what access you have. He just knows if he takes one away and it causes a problem, someone's going to yell at him. So he's going to do the easiest route and authorize everything, keep his fingers crossed that nothing goes wrong. And at scale, his risk is low, just like you mentioned earlier, that I spread this out over a small amount of risk against cost. What we have to actually start looking at now is if I am going to make decisions based on attributes, which I will argue are much more attestable than groups. You can know what department I'm in, what title I have, what projects I'm on, what applications you gave me access to. You recognize things about me that are quantifiable. And those are what policies drive decisions on access. Then you actually have the ability to audit your environment. But the zero trust model is saying, first, we need to unwind everything we've done in this everybody gets everything, and then we just don't worry about it model. But the challenge on the business side is, I think you pointed at the very beginning, people don't know why people have access to things. The role mining tools we had years ago to try and figure all this out algorithmically didn't do a very good job because there's not really recognizable patterns. People got what they got because they asked for it, or somebody gave it to them, or a job they used to have they don't have now, it's left over. So there's really a lot of house cleaning to do, and it has to be a partnership between the business and the IT organization. And you've got to bring HR into the conversation early, because for decades, HR and IT didn't talk to each other. They didn't interact, and people would come and go, and IT would never know. So you've got to get everyone talking at the table, but that says interrupt what you do for the rest of your job and go into meetings and to start deciding what to do going forward. And that's a large project that takes a lot of momentum to get rolling and a lot of sponsorship to keep going. That's how you'll get there, but it's a tough road to hoe.
Wait, I got a thing up there, which is that absolutely policy all day. But then the edge cases always creep in. And that's where, oh man, I guess I am going to have to give that person access, to this specific thing. And that speaks to complexity. So the other thing that came to mind there that was obviously I'm all in on that answer that you were given. The fact that credentials that are valid 24/7, 365 should basically be treated like radioactive material, because like the potential for not necessarily in the moment damage, but damage, generations or several new hires down the road. The fact that credential could still potentially be out there with a lot of access, that's a huge problem. So keeping those out of people's hands, I think, is potentially one of those high line, like, this is one way to help, right?
Yeah, there's really basic cleanup. If you haven't done the basic cleanup already, go find all your orphaned accounts. Go find all the accounts for people that either got abandoned inside an application, people left the organization months or years ago. These are highly compromisable, because if someone's in those accounts and doing something bad, no one's even watching. No one even notices, why is my email unread all my documents I didn't actually look at yet? So there's some basic remedial cleanup to do. And I think you also mentioned earlier, which is critical, is look at the network security. Look at what you can do immediately to segment your environment. What can I do on my firewalls? What can I do on the ingress egress points to actually be more aware of what's happening and what's coming in? Maybe I start registering devices so your nephew's jailbroken iPhone at a hijacked Starbucks Wi-Fi is no longer a good way to get into the company.
I think anybody who's worked for any kind of company probably still has access to something that they no longer need, or probably work in another organization that they no longer are employed by. They could probably find something they could log in, and that's just become part of the human condition, and maybe the bad guys know this.
Oh, I think they definitely know it. And if you look at, there's some major, and interestingly enough, there are major compromises. One that comes to mind is Target. That was actually their HVAC company that was compromised as a side attack to their network. And then you've got Sony, which was a compromised admin account that gave them keys to the kingdom. But these were all accounts that weren't being properly locked down, managed, and monitored. And that's where you have a lot of exposure. If you've got dormant accounts, and even if you're doing things like service accounts where you checked out the credentials and they're good for X number of months, that alone is something that no one's watching, no one's monitoring. That's a highly valued endpoint to attack. So you go where the money is, you go where the power is in the system, and try to compromise those and try and stay as stealthy as you can.
Josh, do you think we lean too much on third parties to give them too much access, because the assumption is that they're all our friends? And
how has remote computing changed the way we think about identity and access management?
Jesus.
What impact has ransomware had?
There we go.
Techstrong. There we go.
Apparently, I leaned on my keyboard and turned on audio read the Word document. So,
oh, really? I thought we had just added a new feature to the platform, and I was like, this is kind of cool.
That was a bad operator trying to screen scrape my material from me. Yeah.
All right, let me rephrase. Yeah. Josh, do you think we lean too much on third parties and we give them, this universal access, but we don't really know what's going on the other side of that agreement, and we don't know who those folks are?
Look, I think the risk is real, but I think that, like any organization approaching, do we want to trust? Like, let's just name some names. Like, do I want to trust Okta to do my universal directory, or do I want to make it myself? Do I want to hire and sort of roll my own, or use some combination of like I'm an old school free and open source software guy. I love it. But oftentimes 2 or 3 or more different projects working together don't actually make the outcome that we think they're going to make. So I think there is a lot of business value, especially on the time axis, to trusting. So maybe you trust but verify. I don't know. There's a lot of approaches to that. And this is where those creatures like GRC teams come in, or those vendor risk teams, or the IGA team that really wants to understand, what does this actually look like for us? And I realize that those all 3 of those teams, all 3 of those creatures are things that exist in much larger enterprises. We're not talking like a small or medium-sized business that's going to have those. So but the risk looks a lot different for a big company, and that's why they have those. They have those kind of teams. I don't know. Wade, I don't know. Did anything that I think your fancy?
I think you're pointing to risk for basically engaging with vendors, but where we see a lot of risk, and I think Mike might have been pointing to, was that I have to collaborate now with a lot of people outside my organization. In a merger and acquisition, I'm going to absorb another company into my environment. I can't just throw open my firewall, put an AD trust in, and just cross my fingers that their security team actually was doing a reasonably good job. That all the exposure they have is exposure I have to incorporate in my risk model. Or I'm working with outside vendors that are linking into my systems. I'm partnering with other people in my business. I'm in a hospital network, and I'm networking with other hospitals and clinics. So that spreads that risk model out now to where I have to not only be aware and cognizant of protecting myself, but I have to vet those that I connect to. I have to build in a mechanism where I can interoperate with them. I can share access to my resources with them, but I can make sure I don't compromise my own platform with them. I have to have an abstraction layer in between me and the outside world that is malleable enough to use to move back and forth and share information, but doesn't allow someone to just come in and wander around and have free access. Because if their site's compromised inherently, then I would be compromised. So that world of integration becomes more complex now if I don't inherently completely trust everyone I'm talking to.
Right. We have a question from the audience, guys. I'm going to throw it to Josh, but it basically says, how should the cybersecurity team evolve or be structured to deal with all this? Because, and I guess it's alluding to the point that, historically security ops focused on managing the firewalls. They might deploy some endpoint stuff, and a lot of times it was the IT folks that were running access management. So where does the security team and the IT team come together, and how do you make this all operationalize it in a way that is scalable?
Yeah, one place my mind goes on that question is these unsung heroes that are in a lot of smaller companies. When we call them data scientists or data storytellers, because oftentimes the existing types of competencies that are on your security teams are great at actually getting things covered and getting data in, but they're not very good at communicating not only value but risk upstream. And that's one of the places where I think that bringing in a data professional can, or training, your folks to brief or, display information in a better way can really, really help you, in the pursuit of making things good and getting the buy-in that you need to make it a priority and on a continuing basis. What else is out there? I mean, look, I think most of the security fundamentals have not changed. We're still doing, all those different domains. We're still counting. I see a lot of kind of exciting companies that are bringing in physical and digital security, trying to put those in a compelling product so that they're not so disjointed. So maybe more of maybe more of on the enterprise side of things, but bringing in a physical security person or making the physical security people interact with the cybersecurity staff. So I don't know.
Wade, you got any advice? Because, honestly, it seems to me we put these people in a hard spot, right? On the one hand, we're saying you can no longer be the office of no, and we want you to enable the business. But on the other hand of it, the minute there's a breach, the first people we call on the carpet are these folks. So how do we kind of strike this balance in a way that works for them?
Well, I think one of the challenges, and we had a account executive who would go into every meeting with his prospects, and one of the first questions he asked was, hey, IT guys, when your app dev and security teams are building out an application or bringing something to the company, when do they involve you? And almost 80% of the time, the word was as an afterthought. That the idea of identity and security on that level was not something that the application integration security teams were thinking about. I think with the advent of zero trust, with the modernization now and the realization of identity access management as we started the conversation being more in the forefront, we're moving towards a more integrated model, but I think Josh is correct. You've got to bring everyone into the conversation early. It should be a component. Identity and access management is a component of security. And in different organizations, I see it fall under the CISO, and sometimes it's under the infrastructure, and sometimes there's somebody that looks at both of those together as a holistic, parameter and defense. So getting everyone talking early, understanding that everyone plays a part in solving the puzzle is really the only way to do this. If we still stay in stovepipe reporting levels, then we're going to solve our own problem, but we're not going to solve the integrated problem. And right now, the solution is an integrated solution. So we have to move towards everyone working together as early as possible.
All right. Well, then to your point, Josh, how do I get everybody on board to this issue? Because let's be fair as well to the security people, but a lot of end users are, a pain in the butt. You got a lot of engineers out there who think that they should have access to everything and anything that they want whenever they want. And they have instituted all kinds of backdoors in the systems to achieve that goal. So, how do we kind of have this conversation as a group in a way that everybody will go, all right, yeah, we recognize that the value to the whole is greater than the needs of the one, as it were?
Well, I think that you need leadership to communicate very effectively on what they want as far as outcomes first. I think without that, you can spend a ton of money and time, and blood, sweat, and treasure, and not really advance your position very much. So I think that's the linchpin, is to have good communication from leadership as to what outcomes are absolutely necessary. And that's not IT specific, that's just any project in business. But look, one of the things that kind of comes to mind here is that we need to really think in terms of just overall processes. Is like, how do you actually do this? How do you intend to do this? How is it done now? And where do you want to actually be based on that guidance? How do you link the two, and what are the ways and means that we're going to use to get to a specific outcome, right? I don't know. That's a hard question, Mike. I don't necessarily know that there's a one size fits all type solution.
Well, I don't know. Let's go back to what Wade was talking about. Maybe when we're too wrapped up in the buzzword around zero trust, when what we really want to do is give people secure access to things in near real time. So we're not trying to manage a bunch of arcane groups. And maybe what we're explaining to people is, the trade-off is, you don't have to sit around and memorize 1,000 different passwords, because, we've got this better system where it's all in near real time. So is there a social contract that we can make with people, Wade, that says, if you work with us on this, we'll make your life easier because the security will be baked into the system more, but, we're going to have to make this transition along the way, and bear with us. Is that where we are?
Yeah, I think you have to really have some honest conversations. You can promise that. I mean, in an ideal world, zero trust is something that all happens in the background. It happens magically. It doesn't make mistakes, and people just get the access they do in the most secure manner physically possible. That's the ideal world. And like they say, I want to live in theory, because in theory, everything works. But they also have to have the realization that this is going to be a journey. Let's maybe pick an application to start with. Let's pick a project to start with. Let's pick a group to start with. Let's get some champions chanting the success of what we can do. Boiling the ocean is the guaranteed way to not succeed in any project. And a lot of times, unfortunately, on the identity and access management side, we've promised to fix all problems in all ways, in that 9-month project, and ended up cutting scope down to make the ability to declare success when we ran out of budget and sponsor. So bringing that group in and incorporating everyone in the conversation, being honest about what we're doing, finding low-hanging fruit. Maybe it's the highest risk pieces you go after. Let's talk to the financial department. That's the one that we're most worried about. Let's have some concrete success. And then you can start bringing people along down the path. I think you have to build that relationship, though, and you've got to build that confidence and trust. I think zero trust is once you can explain to someone how it works and what you're doing and the end result that you're pushing for, you can get buy-in on that sounds like a reasonable way to go forward compared to what I have now, which is really unmanaged and uncontrolled and highly risky, and then start moving people that direction incrementally.
So, you know, one of the things that was on my mind during what you're saying there, Wade, is that like it's very like when a lot of times these things are just so new. Like, look, the legacy tools that we have to do IAM or PAM type functions just weren't designed and created during during the era where we actually live, right? Like, so that they're already kind of I wouldn't call them obsolete because they're still doing important things, but they're just not necessarily flexible enough to pivot to the way people are working now or organizations are working now. Mm-hmm. So how do you bring, how do you bring a Fortune 100 bank along with you on a zero trust journey if you know that they have 4 decades worth of IT investments and, hundreds of personnel doing that same thing? And maybe it's you're trying to eat the elephant one bite at a time, like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Don't try to do the whole thing. But it's interesting, like how can you fit that in a way that makes it an impact and can get adopted? And I think that a lot of those are, like Mike said, if you have 1,000 different passwords and usernames to remember, you're in trouble, right? And even if you're using, a password vault, like, I don't know, 1Password or, Bitwarden, even that can be overwhelming for people, and, their access to it can not work. They're still having to manage a real credential. So I think one of the most meaningful things to getting to that might actually be completely taking credentials out of people's hands. Like, just don't deal with it anymore. Have it dealt with, with some sort of zero trust solution.
And I scratch my head sometimes because I feel like we do make advances, but then we don't share the benefits. And I'll give you my example. It's like, so I get a credit card. The credit card has a chip in it, and I take it to the store, but I still got to put the card in the machine, add my PIN, and for insult for injury, sign it as well. And it's like, guys, if we're going to put these chips in these cards, maybe we should give people a better experience. I know in Europe they have a better notion of, here's how to use your card. But it seems like, at least here in the US, all we did was just, add another step to a process to annoy people. And so, do we need to take a giant step back here and think about the user experience, and where does security fit in that conversation? Josh, what do you think?
I think that the second you make something more difficult, or you put up barriers, that is going to engender the reflex to, the dreaded shadow IT world, is where, like, oh man, if I can't get, a new VPC stood up, I've got to do something in AWS, and I can't get the admins to, the person that actually will write the AWS check to do it for me. I might be tempted to just go out and do it myself. Because it's easier. And that's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night as an admin. The fact that you don't have any kind of audit trail on what people did. You may get results, but you don't know where the skeletons got buried. Like, you have all that radioactive material out there, and maybe corporate secrets. That's scary.
Right. And that's assuming they even stay on the cloud you want them to stay on, because they'll just go to one that's easier and they can just use their own credit card and call it even. Or in my example, they'll stop using the card altogether and they'll just pull out their phone and use Apple Pay. And that's even, that's not what the bank ultimately wants you to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in also too, in the zero trust conversation, if you think about it, the idea is that I'm doing granular attribute-based access control in the moment for applications. And the reality of it is most applications out there are not capable of understanding that. They haven't externalized their authorization model to a policy decision point, a policy enforcement point. But I'm talking to more and more organizations now that are looking at their internal app development, and net new is going to be externalized authorization. So you're going to have this world of hybrid environments where we're going to have net new applications that are able to use this modern infrastructure. You're going to have a large amount of legacy, and I don't mean legacy in 30 years old, legacy in 5 years old, infrastructure that's built on the previous model. But what I'm encouraged by is, if you look at the move to the cloud, 7 years ago, if you talk to somebody about having a SaaS app chances are it wasn't really a SaaS app. It didn't speak SAML. They couldn't do external authorization with a token. They just taken their application, put it on Rackspace, and called it a cloud app. But we drove the industry as customers to standards. SAML, OIDC, OAuth, application integration was more cookie cutter and cut and play. We'll get there also. I think we'll drive the industry forward in net new applications in the zero trust infrastructure. So once you move the infrastructure that direction, integration will be easier, but it gives you that benefit, again, you mentioned, of cutting down passwords. My security risk goes down if I have an integrated application in my zero trust environment. Therefore, on my RFIs and RFPs, that's the first question I have. Do you integrate with my zero trust environment? And we'll move the model that way, slowly, incrementally shifting the center line more towards modern, but it'll take years. And again, like we were talking before the call, there's going to be applications out there that'll never move. You know, we're still today looking at mainframe and green screen apps that we can't bring into a modern world. We're going to have another generation of unmovable applications that we'll still have to live with.
So I want to get this clear. You're suggesting that the 50 variations of my favorite password that on the dark web are less secure than moving in this model, right?
Well, this model is talking about authorization, and the password is authentication. So you really kind of have to split the two apart. And moving towards a passwordless authentication model where you're not, required to remember something, but you have an innate two-factor model. I've got a physical device here with a registered SIM that is tied to my identity that looked at a biometric before I could access it. That's my key to get in the door. That's registered and validated, and within certain parameters, trusted. Or some other model where I come in with a card of some kind or some kind of token that says, I know who you are, even though and I may ask you for a PIN to go with your card to prove you know something and you have something. But the idea of just entering in a credential is something we have to move away from. And if we can make it seamless for the user, if we can make it something highly secure that's not cumbersome, that I've gotten really good now at memorizing 7-digit numbers for a short period of time because of all the soft PIN codes I get sent to access things. It used to be hard. We need to get to something in the next generation, and companies are working on it, where that authentication event that you guarantee you know who I am is more seamless, more secure, more out of the box. And then I build all my infrastructure around authorization. I don't give you access to anything but the minimum. I know who you are. And now I incrementally give you more access to more resources as you need them. And when you're done, I pull that all back away. So there's no residual profile laying around for someone else to compromise.
Yeah, I totally agree there. And Mike, can I add one more thing to what we were saying? Look, yeah, auth-z, or the authorization, is always going to be, or is very frequently going to be heterogeneous, right? It's not going to look the same, even if the auth-in, the authentication, is a very set thing. Can we add auditing to that to make a uniform auditing, requirement around that, so that when it does look, so when Josh or somebody pretending to be Josh comes in and starts putting escape character sequences in instead of the UTF-8 characters, maybe that works in a different way, or maybe some other auditing tool doesn't catch that like I would expect as an admin. So bring the audit along with all of that work that you're doing to take the fangs out of auth-z.
I wish they would just automate it one small step further, right? So maybe I'm just too slow, but the text comes in and I get the numbers with the 7 digits in it. And by the time I get to the fourth one, the message just flashed off and now I can't remember. And now I'm trying to get that text lined up with the window on the browser and kind of rekey all that in. And I think a lot of end users go, this is more trouble than it may be worth. So how do we get to the point where maybe the thing's just a little smoother, where the number comes in and I can just say yes, and it will automatically punch it into the place that I'm trying to access with my new authentication? I feel like the steps and processes aren't quite as smooth as they could be. So can we make that better?
Well, we're trying as an industry. There are a lot of companies out there figuring out ways to do that. I was at a conference, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago with a panel of 7 password, two-factor passwordless vendors, all saying in the next 2 years, passwords will be gone. You don't need to worry about them anymore. And that was 7 years ago. And I'm still typing in passwords every day. So we're working on it, I think, as an industry. I think there are potential models out there for making that more ubiquitous. I think personally, from my perspective, and I don't know how real this is, it's just because I've owned a phone forever. Everybody I know has a phone. And that is a really intelligent, I mean, there's more computing power in my phone than it took the guys to go to the moon. And that platform should be something we can use as something I have, something I know model where I don't have to type in a soft pin that apparently now people are worried about man in the middle, sending the wrong pins and things like that to your site, or sending you to a spoof site and having you put the pin in there and it's not the right one. They use it to act. So even that extra cumbersome step is not necessarily wholly secure. So I think we need to get there and we're on our way, hopefully.
Yeah, I was trying to find my tinfoil hat. It's out of reach right now. So, but like a lot of us are using. See if I can hold this up. YubiKeys or hardware tokens. In the federal world, you have the CAC and PIV cards, which, same concept. But look, I mean, in the world of Web3 and people that have really, really large crypto wallets, it's totally unacceptable to accept an SMS as a second factor, just specifically because you can man in the middle of that in some really accessible ways, at least to the underground that does that kind of thing. So there have been large crypto wallet thefts specifically because of man in the middle. So I want WebAuthn and those kind of things to take off in ways, and maybe we're going to see that soon. But maybe it's the same thing. Like 2 years from now, we're not going to use it. Maybe keep entering passwords. I don't know.
I would just point out that for as advanced as we all think we are, the password has been in use since the first caveman grunted, "Who goes there?" So, So Wade, what's your best advice to folks to make it simpler, smoother, and to move to this whole new world that we're envisioning? What would you be doing? What would you be thinking about if you were running these ops? Where's the place to get started?
Well, I think like any journey, you can't go anywhere until you know where you are. So take an inventory of what you have. Figure out where your infrastructure is. There are a lot of components you probably already own that can plug into your zero trust infrastructure. You can start building around. Look at what you need in order to start connecting things together. How do you bring identity information together from multiple sources and make that available? What kind of platforms are you on that are going to be able to support you going forward? Where do you need to make investments? And then at the same time, take a look at the nature of your environment. How much IT debt do you have? I talked to a major bank once and everybody in the room said, yeah, we all agree our multi-AD domain model is such a mess that we can't even audit it. But our CIO knows that it's a career ender, so no one's allowed to talk about it. You can't operate in that world. You have to be able to start taking the bull by the horns. And that starts out with discovery and understanding and auditing and looking into your systems and figuring out where things are. Start having conversations with the business people. Find that department that you can trust and start to figure out who has access to what and why. What are the onboarding processes? Is anybody even have a manager in their profile? If I had to authorize a request programmatically because they're somebody I could identify as the right person to do that. A lot of organizations, that information is not anywhere easily found. So you need to know what you're starting with, and then you can start to map out how you're going to incrementally move forward. What are the first mountains I'm going to try and climb? What's the highest return for the least effort to start with? But that initial visibility is key. You can't go blindly into buying a new IGA product and figuring out that the consultants will solve all your problems implementing it. They're more blind than you are. So you have to know where you are to start with.
All right. So like many difficult conversations, we don't talk about it, nothing's going to happen, right? Exactly. Josh, what's your best advice to folks?
Personally, I would try to get a solution that can work in many contexts for zero trust, for getting those passwords out of users' hands, and one that can use an auth system that you already have. Look, I am definitely not advocating for everybody to just, rip and replace all of their, directory stuff. We're going to have to find a way to make that work. So getting a solution in place that can work in many different silos. And then number two is engaging experts for different domains of control. So they're already in your organization. So whether that means talking to the DBAs or talking to, the app developers that are maintaining that legacy app, there is expertise there. Get them in the picture and help them understand how you can help them to help you understand how you can wrap this new processes or this zero trust approach around access so that your users can actually deliver value to your business. That's the thing, because as soon as you're putting up, if the office of no, rears its head again, we're cooked. So yeah.
All right, guys, let me ask you this, since you can't throw a proverbial cat these days without somebody talking about AI. But wait, can AI save us from ourselves someday in this context? Can the machines figure out who's who and manage it for us?
I wish. The challenge I have is that especially on the nature of access, we're talking about data and access management. The idea that, I got all my access over 20 years in an organization, from being in 7 different departments, having 6 different titles, coming and going on a leave of absence, and all the things that happened. I don't know of an algorithm out there that understands that journey. Now, that's my journey. And the idea, as I understand it, in machine learning is we look for patterns by analyzing large amounts of data and find commonality and find anomalies. But if everything's an anomaly and nothing's a pattern, then I don't know how the machine starts. And my fear is that in a lot of infrastructure in the identity space, it is a role bloat, an unmanaged chaos that has very little commonality. I think you almost may do better on AI machine learning if you try and model a fictional best case scenario and then see how you can back your infrastructure into it, other than trying to analyze the spaghetti you have right now.
All right, Josh, last thought there, because what he just said is there's more exceptions than rules.
Yeah. Look, I think AI or machine learning, like, let me speak to ML more as the thing that I think is more useful there. I think understanding your baseline and how it changes over time is a really important thing. So if you don't understand the base rate for for access management or identity type transactions, in your business processes, that's a place where I could see it helping. And I see that as more of like the co-pilot, not the thing that's in charge, but the thing that says, hey, maybe you should check this out. And maybe this is not just, one of 5,000 other alerts you're going to get today, Mr. SOC supervisor, et cetera, or Mrs. NOC supervisor. That's where I think there's potential for it to help. But that, that's going to involve those data professionals, right? Those are those people that you need, like, we need help often to tell the story in a way that makes sense to our caveman brain, So yeah, bring it on.
All right, guys. Hey guys, thanks. My last piece of advice would be, if you start developing a personal relationship with that co-pilot, maybe you might want to take a step back. But other than that, it's all good. Cody, I'm going to give it back to you. Take us home, and we have some certificates and gifts and good things like that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, Wade, and Josh, for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to quickly remind our audience that this panel was recorded. You should be receiving an email with a link to access that recording on demand. You can also find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So like Mike mentioned, we do have those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give out. Our first winner is Parimal G. Our second winner is Somu G. Our third winner is Marie L. Our fourth and final winner is Orlando H. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, please check your spam folder. So to everyone, we really appreciate you spending time with us today. We ask for 1 extra moment of your time to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But Otherwise, we do hope to see you at an upcoming Techstrong Learning workshop or webinar. And to Wade, Josh, Mike, again, thank you once more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.